District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
This episode is brought to you by Experian. Are you paying for subscriptions you don't use, but can't find the time or energy to cancel them? Experian could cancel unwanted subscriptions for you, saving you an average of $270 per year and plenty of time. Download the Experian app. Results will vary. Not all subscriptions are eligible. Savings are not guaranteed. Paid membership with connected payment account required.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I am your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Today on the program, we welcome Chris Martz, a student meteorologist who is taking Twitter by storm with his very intelligent musings and commentary on all things environment, climate change crisis rhetoric, energy development, and hypocrisies of a lot of climate alarmists. We do a deep dive into a lot of different subjects, ranging from is there really a climate crisis afoot to why young people even may not be prioritizing fighting climate change and even supporting government action to fight climate change, and crazy former professors gone wild who are calling for climate culling. That's perhaps my favorite headline of late, and Chris is going to break all this down today on District of Conservation. I think you're going to love what he has to say, the realism that he communicates, and he definitely has a bright future, and we need people in meteorology and climate science who think more like him. Get to know Chris Martz on the program today. We often hear a lot about climate change crisis, and people are looking for sober analysis into whether or not we're truly in a crisis, what meteorological facts are actually underpinned by climate. We want to make sure that, or I think more of the American people want to have kind of a clear view into weather versus climate. And one person I've been following very closely, and I'm so thrilled to have on the podcast, is Chris Martz. And he is a student meteorologist, and he has very interesting musings. And I think if you're not already familiar with his musings, his tweets, his observations, I think you will be. So Chris, welcome to District of Conservation. Good to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Gabby. I appreciate it. It's an honor to be here, and I'm glad we can do this.
What propelled you to have an interest in climate and also going into meteorology?
Well, in 2015, December 2015, and I've always had an interest in weather going back to when I was a little kid. The Greensburg, Kansas 2007 tornado kind of sparked my interest in weather. And then it kind of shifted away from severe weather and to more synoptic, larger scale pattern recognition and climate stuff. But what really kind of sparked that interest was in December 2015, we had a really warm December in the eastern United States. I think it was the warmest December on record, second to 1889, or maybe slightly even warmer. It was comparable. And I remember we were in church on Christmas Eve, and it was 75 degrees. And now at the time, I wasn't really well versed in a whole lot of this. And I was really concerned. I was like, this is not normal. It should not be 75 degrees on Christmas Eve. This is crazy. I thought, like, this is really bad. We're destroying the planet. And then shortly afterward, fast forward a few weeks to mid-January, 2016, we had the blizzard on the East Coast, and we had 36 inches of snow at my house in northwestern Virginia. And it was really cold, and I was like, okay, these kinds of extremes, this is kind of interesting how it could go from being 75 degrees to having a blizzard that drops 3 feet of snow. And I was worried that, and then over the next couple of years, we had some really, really mild winters. And I was like, and I had always had this picture in my mind that winters used to be much colder than they were. And I guess some of that's from all the Christmas movies and stuff we watch. And I was concerned that we're warming the planet too rapidly. And we had Hurricane Harvey in 2017 and Maria. And I thought that all these things were unprecedented. I was buying a lot of the news stories and stuff. And then I came across meteorologist Joe Bastardi from Weather Bell Analytics, who I've become good friends with, and then Tony Heller, a geologist who runs the realclimatescience.com blog. And both of them started talking. I found their YouTube channel. I found Tony's YouTube channel and his Twitter page and Joe's Twitter page, and they started talking about all these extreme weather events from the past. And they posted these newspaper clippings, and they posted these statistics and data that's compiled by NOAA and all these other government agencies. And I began to start questioning a lot of the media hype over these extreme events, such as hurricanes and the really warm, the mild winters that and it turns out that these things have always occurred. They've happened in the past dozens and dozens of times. And what we see today is often, in most cases, it's not unprecedented. If you go back far enough in the historical record, all these extreme events have occurred. So my views began to change once I actually began to immerse myself in the data and educate myself and not just regurgitate talking points. And so I decided that I had a passion for this, and that the route to go would be pursuing a meteorology degree, a degree in atmospheric science. And I decided that I got into a whole bunch of good schools, a whole lot of programs, including Penn State, George Mason University, SUNY Albany, SUNY Oswego, Colorado State, and Virginia Tech. And then there was a small school called Millersville University near Lancaster, Pennsylvania, or as they say, Lancaster. You have to say it that way, or the locals get mad at you. And one of the professors, the chair of the department, was really he was really enthusiastic about what he did, and he really pulled me in. So that's where I decided to end up going. And I'm now a senior meteorology major. I'm going to be graduating next May with my bachelor's of science in meteorology. So that's kind of my background, my story.
You think typically, and I'm a little older than you, a lot of people who go into meteorology seem to be very political. I just want to hear the weatherman, weatherwoman deliver reports. I don't want to be lectured about my behaviors and what is happening. I just want to know what's happening in a very kind of concrete, but to the point, matter. And I think we have seen and observed in the last maybe 10 to 15 years that meteorology has become so politicized. You, as someone who is rising the ranks in that industry and you hope to go into it more professionally post-college, why do you think it has been so politicized? And do you think that maybe with just different information coming out and maybe just this propensity to be a little more even-keeled, could it perhaps change the industry to be less political, more neutral?
I think that a lot of people are in general, a lot of people are very political, and a lot of meteorologists I know and students that I know that I go to school with have very strong political opinions, one way or the other. And I think a lot of science people are political because science affects everyday life, from medicine to transportation to communications. Scientific advancements have enabled these technologies and have improved the quality of human life over the last several hundred years. And science very much influences public policy, from energy policy to whatever. And so some issues, or more than others, can be very much underpinned by political interference. Certain politicians and political parties, they want to use the scientific community to build their case for a specific policy outcome, whatever that may be. And scientists who are involved in publishing science that influence these policies have very strong opinions about what they think is right and wrong. And global warming and climate change is pretty much the perfect Goldilocks issue for political opportunists to get their agenda passed, to gain public support to get a specific agenda passed that would probably not be passed on its own merits without climate change being the poster child for passing these policies. In the late 1980s, the science of global warming theory in and of itself has been understood for decades. And inherently, the theory of global warming and the causes of it, there's nothing really controversial about that. Most skeptic or lukewarm scientists agree with the underlying premise of it. It has a scientific footing, a scientific basis. And it really began to take off in the late 1980s with the likes of NASA's Dr. James Hansen, who made all these obviously wrong predictions about sea level rise and global temperature, Arctic sea ice retreat. But it began to really capture the minds of politicians like Al Gore and other and the United Nations in the late 1980s, and then that's when they created the IPCC. And these bureaucrats, the IPCC, it's people seem to believe that the IPCC was created, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They believe it was created by these scientists that they just got together one day and they said, "Oh, let's investigate the causes of natural climate change and let's see if there's any human influences there. Let's band together and come up with this research project." That's not what happened. Political opportunists, bureaucrats who were part of the United Nations saw this climate change issue, the idea that the greenhouse gas emissions are causing this rapid, harmful warming to the planet. They saw this as an opportunity. Oh, well, let's restrict energy use. Let's control. Let's issue policies to control people because we see this as a perfect opportunity to do that. Because if we can get scientists to publish this research that says that our use of fossil fuels is harming the planet, well, we can then if we portray that as bad and we alarm the public about it, we can pass legislation and we can get public support for it that'll restrict their energy use and give them the illusion of security and safety that we're going to save the planet. When reality is they just want to be able to micromanage everybody's lives and dictate their daily habits, from the kind of cars you can drive and the food that you eat to how far you can travel, where you can travel, how often you're allowed to travel, and what kind of appliances you can use, like with the heat pumps, and what kind of stoves you can buy. They want to be able to micromanage your life and control every aspect of it. And they want to make energy unaffordable such that you're dependent on government-approved energy technologies that are intermittent and that they have to be rationed. So it became a very political issue, and there's very much a political wing to it for certain motivations, for a more authoritarian agenda.
Especially since government has gotten more in bed with scientific inquiry. In the 1950s, and I was reading this from a book that I got from going to a congressional event where, I forget who it was, but someone at CFACT had worked very closely with the authors, or one of the authors. I believe he was a scholar at CFACT, and he passed away a few years ago. But the book was so great, and it talked about how the politicization of science really started to take hold in the 1950s when it used to be privately funded. And now it has moved to being strictly government funded, no other means. Usually you may get some foundation money, of course, but it's primarily government funding. So that, I think, could be why we see a lot of climate alarmism, this climate doomism. And I want to ask your thoughts about this whole climate crisis narrative, because anyone who looks at data will see that climate deaths, or deaths caused by natural disasters, are down to historic lows. I think 96%, 98%. Somewhere in the 90% category, yet they continue to perpetuate this narrative that we're in a crisis, even though we have more greening, we have less deforestation. There are, I think, 18,000 new species discovered annually each year. We have lower emissions, water and air quality is significantly better, especially here in the United States. Why do you think, in your opinion, they continue to push this, even though the data shows that we're not in a crisis, or we're increasingly away from a crisis?
Oh, that's a good question. I want to back up. I'll answer that. I want to go back up to one of your points about the politicization of science since the 1950s. And you're right, a lot of research, in fact, most scientific research that's conducted by professors, academic, because if you're a professor in a university, you are required to publish research every so often in order to especially get tenure status. So you're required to conduct research, and it has to be approved, and a lot of that money comes from the federal government grants. And some of it's private, but most of it is funded for by the national, like organizations like the National Science Foundation. NASA also funds a lot of it. NOAA funds a lot of research, and hundreds of thousands of people are bankrolled by this climate industrial complex. Their livelihoods depend. All these people that work for the United Nations and they work for these government agencies, their careers and their livelihoods, their income to support their families is dependent on there being a quote unquote climate crisis. And scientists have to, in order to secure funding, and especially in order to get published and continue to receive funding thereafter, they have to publish research results or find data that fits a certain storyline that these journal editors want to portray, because they're in bed with with the IPCC and the United Nations in creating this alarm. Because if there's no climate emergency, if there's nothing to be concerned about, if it's not that big of an issue, then there's no reason for these scientists to continue being funded. There's no use for all these bureaucrats to, quote unquote, manage the crisis and come up with these policies that they want to implement. They'd be out of a job. So there has to, and if somebody speaks out against that, that's especially an academic, their funding gets severed, because they're putting everybody else's career at stake if they speak out and they start getting, popularity. We see this all the time. And you have to, and while the data in these studies that are published that portray all these alarming scenarios isn't necessarily, it's not fabricated, because if you fabricate data, that even if you fabricate data, that's going to look bad on you and you're going to lose your job. That's what happened to some scientists that fabricated ocean acidification data in Australia. They made it worse than it. They made up data and several studies, and the authors got, I think they lost their jobs for it. So you can't make up data, but what you can do as a scientist trying to get, because if you're an academic, if you're a publishing research scientist, your career depends on, and your success in academia depends on how many papers you get published. So you need to work to get your work published in prestigious journals like Nature and Science Magazine and the AMS journals or whatever, and you need to be, your work needs to be perceived as important such that it contributes to the body of knowledge and other scientists cite it. And then you get recognition, you get more funding to do more research, to publish more papers, to get your H-index up. And you also get this name recognition interviews, awards from organizations like the American Geophysical Union. And it makes you it gives you notoriety, sort of like Dr. Michael Mann, for instance, or Dr. Gavin Schmidt. And in order to get, some of these journal editors have a pre-approved narrative that you have to choose. They're less interested now in understanding the physical science basis of climate dynamics and understanding what drives our climate system and quantifying, if possible, any human impact on the climate. They want you to publish papers that portray these really ridiculous scenarios for the future, these RCP 8.5 scenarios, these high emission scenarios that are not going to happen. They want you to use those for the basis of a study, look at future impacts, and discuss how climate change, man-made climate change specifically, impacts extreme weather events. They don't want you to look at, in the case of Dr. Patrick T. Brown, a climate scientist that follows me on Twitter, and I follow him, a great resource for information. He admitted in a op-ed last year that in order to get a paper published on wildfires in the journal Nature, he and his team of 7 authors, they looked at how climate change specifically is impacting wildfire regimes in California, and they looked at how reducing emissions in the future is that was the focal point of reducing the severity and mitigating the effects of wildfires. They purposely, he admitted this, they did not investigate better forest management practices. They didn't discuss putting power lines underground or better zoning codes, not building houses in these forests, because if they did that, and those factors are probably far more important than any climatic impacts. If they included those other factors, then the journal would not have published it, because it doesn't portray climate change as the dominant factor. And then they manipulated some statistics and played around with statistics to get more alarming results. So the data wasn't made up, because that looks bad, but you can alter the data a little bit, or use statistics and stuff and manipulate it a little bit to get kind of a desired result. One example of this is the IPCC report when they talk about tropical cyclone trends. They will say that there has been an increase in the proportion of major hurricanes, which is category 3 or higher on the Saffir-Simpson wind scale. But if you actually look at the data that Dr. Ryan Maui has published in his own research papers, and you look at the data from Colorado State University that Phil Klotzbach publishes, the actual number of Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes has remained steady since 1980 and 1990, depending on when you start the data set. And the total number of hurricanes, which includes Category 1 through 5, the total number of hurricane strength tropical cyclones has actually decreased. So a greater proportion of them, a greater percentage of them reach major hurricane status, but that's because that's what happens when you set it up as a ratio. It's very deceptive. The actual number of major hurricanes is not increasing. It's just that the weaker ones are becoming less common. And a study done by Phil Klotzbach, I think in 2020 or 2022, was they found that the downturn in activity has been due to a tendency towards increased La Nina occurrences in the last 3 decades. And that has driven, because of clear waters, that's driven a downturn in tropical cyclone activity in the West Pacific Basin, where most of our tropical cyclone activity is. And as a result, and what's interesting is that climate models project more El Nino events in a warming climate, not more La Nina. So that's kind of a contradiction with climate models. The idea that we're in a climate crisis, and I remember where we were, the people that are able to get away with publishing these narratives about there being a climate crisis, the reason that they're able to get away with it so easily is because most people are simply lazy and they just believe the bulleted talking points that they see on social media or whatever news site that they get their information from. These people don't actually, if you see a headline from CNN that says new study says blah, 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 blah is the worst ever, and you look at the study and you look at the article, most people aren't going to either read on the headline or the article. They're not going to go and dig into the peer-reviewed literature and do their own research and look at the data and see whether or not the news media is portraying the research findings correctly. And they don't look at other studies that might have a different conclusion. They don't look at the actual data and do a deep dive into it. And I say that because that was me at one point when I used to I kind of believed in all this alarmist nonsense. I mean, I wasn't a climate doomer, but I believe that climate change was a serious problem up until about 5-6 years ago. And when I began to look at the data myself, that's when my views began to change. But a lot of people they either don't care, they don't have time to read into it, or they're just too lazy to do it. And so they just regurgitate everything. And it's very easy, because people are so gullible in that way, for the government and scientists with political motive to push climate change alarmism, because people are going to eat it up and believe it, and they're not going to bother to fact check it. They're just going to say, well, the experts say this, and they blindly put a trust in authority without actually looking into the data themselves. That's why they're able to get away with it. That's my opinion.
Chris, I wanted to ask you your thoughts on 2 interesting events. Let's start first with this crazy tirade from a climate professor. I think he calls himself a volcanoist, who has a propensity to call for climate culling. He has these Malthusian tendencies, and let me pull up his name. I think his name is Professor Bill McGuire. And he had tweeted, if I'm brutally honest, the only realistic way I see climate emissions falling as fast as they need to avoid catastrophic climate breakdown is the culling of the human population by a pandemic with a very high fatality rate. And then he tweets, I am, in all caps, right? I am deleting the initial tweet now, not because I regret it, but because so many people out there have mistakenly or intentionally taken it the wrong way. And when I hit back at him, he tweeted back at me saying, you're a liar. I did not call for any such thing. Read my words and don't impose them with your crass interpretation on them. I don't think I was crass in calling out the comparison of his tweets. And I wasn't the only one who called him out. A lot of people jumped in on his crazy comments. And it's really funny when you use the words of these alarmists against them, they accuse you of being crass and project their insecurities onto you. And actually, this is not the first time he's called for culling people in the name of fighting climate change or reducing climate emissions. What is your thought on people like this? Because they seem to be boomers who hold these views. You don't really see this. I mean, you see some crazy younger people too, maybe not as Malthusian as like these types who grew up during Paul Ehrlich's time. But these boomers are still spewing this Malthusian population control diatribe to say that that's the only way to achieve climate reductions or some betterment of the environment. We know that's not the case, but what are your thoughts on musings like this?
Yeah, I engaged with him too, and he actually blocked me.
Me too.
And the reason he blocked me is because I utterly embarrassed him. He has like 2,000 more followers than I do. I mean, he has like 30,000 or something. But he tweeted that, and I replied. He got like 100 as of like a couple of hours ago. He had 100. I went on my alt account that I have that I don't tell anybody about. And I went to the feed, and he had like 163 likes on it. And my reply to him, it turns out, has like 900.
Wow.
And then his quote tweet got like 145, and then my reply to him got like 200. My next reply to him that got me blocked was like 220. And then I screenshotted it and posted it on my own page, and I got like 58,000 views on it and over 1,000 likes on it that I woke up to this morning. So that was cool. But the thing, and you make a really good point. This professor, he's actually retired. He's a professor emeritus. He's a retired professor from the University College of London, UCL, and he was a professor of climate and geophysical hazards, I believe, if I'm correct. And he's retired, but recently retired. But regardless, you see a lot of this rhetoric all of a sudden, and I think Dr. Ryan Maui tweeted about it. All of these, after last year when the Atlantic Ocean became record warm or something, all these people started freaking out. All these professors, these boomer academics that are either retired professors or near retirement, and these like biology professors and chemistry professors and ecologists who are not even remotely climate alarm. Now, I personally do not care much about qualifications. I think the validity of your argument and the points that you make are much more important, but than having credentials. Credentials are more like, it's important, but I think whether or not your argument's legitimate or not is more important. But climate change activists always like to appeal to authority, and they like to cite the experts. And yet these people are not qualified climate scientists. They're not atmospheric scientists. They're not ocean scientists. And they're making all these ridiculous claims about the climate catastrophe and global boiling, and we need to reduce the population. And we see a lot of this, especially with a lot of the baby boomer academics. Now, I'm sure people that are listening to this, because I've tweeted about this before, that they're going to accuse me of making broad generalizations. But I was talking with Craig this morning about this, and we kind of agreed. There seems to be like a paradigm shift between generations. The people that seem to be most in touch with reality tend to be the silent generation, those born before like 1945 or so, like my grandparents, and then Generation X, which are my parents' generation, the ones in the 60s, 70s, and maybe early 80s. But you see a lot of these people that were baby boomers that were pro freedom of speech, anti-establishment, freedom-loving hippies in the 1970s and 60s and 70s. A lot of those people then went on to get their higher education, and they thought that their degrees made them better than everybody else. And they took over these academic institutions and have spent the last 40, 50 years in academia. And once millennials went into college, they began indoctrinating them with this similar mindset. So we see a lot of similarities between millennial ideology collectively. And of course, there's always exceptions to that. And then you see them kind of echo the baby boomers' thoughts, whereas you see Generation X kind of be more on the conservative, I guess, side of things, like the silent generation. And Gen Z, at least in my circles, seems to be shifting more towards what Generation X. They don't seem to be echoing a lot of the millennial and boomer sentiment. But what's interesting about people like Bill, Professor McGuire, is that they like to talk about how, and he openly stated, and I mean, he of course, he likes to say, well, we took it out of context. No, we didn't. You just got caught red-handed by a lot of people, and you got publicly humiliated for your ridiculous comment. But he stated that we need to have a mass reduction in human population by a pandemic that has a very high fatality rate. He says that, I was talking about economics. No, you weren't. Maybe I could understand maybe you misusing the word culling if you didn't include the last part of that sentence about a pandemic with a very high fatality rate. His intentions were very clear with that. And you never see any of these people who are talking about the planet being overpopulated. And a lot of these academics, they say that, well, we need to reduce the human population. This other professor, I think it was William Ripple or Triple or whatever his name is, was talking about, he's like a retired professor of, I think, biology or something. And he has me blocked on Twitter as well. He stated that he had posted a meme, like a world without bees and a world without some other species, and in a world without humans, it was like all dandy and fine and wonderful, basically advocating for humans to go extinct. You never see any of these people that are advocating for this ever want to just go maybe remove themselves from the earth. They think that their existence is okay and fine. They're superior to everybody else, but everybody else, the rest of the population needs to decrease. You never see them want to go volunteer and,
No.
I don't know, off themselves. You never see them volunteer that. And that tells me that these are unserious people and that their motives have nothing to do with science.
It's the same with net zero proponents. They tell us you have to decarbonize. And the running joke, I see this in memes all the time, people post, you are the carbon they want to get rid of. And it's very true because carbon is so essential to life in many regards. But the net zero proponents are the people who hate, red meat consumption, agriculture, conventional energy development. They never will wean themselves off. And I had a interesting exchange at one of my recent speeches at Georgia State University at their law school. It was my first law school speech. And I had asked one of the students in attendance who had pressed me, like, he had said, well, yes, I'm a hypocrite because I can't get rid of it, but I do want to still chart a net zero course. So they're not entirely, I would say, not incognizant, but they're not not cognizant of their kind of hypocrisy. I think more starting to come around, and they can't grapple with that kind of juxtaposition of getting rid of stuff that makes you live a first world lifestyle, yet wanting to have scarcity and, go on this kind of unsustainable future path, which promises great things, sunshine and unicorns, but doesn't deliver baseload power. It's much more expensive. All of it is subsidized by the government. And you're not going to necessarily have less in emissions. I've very extensively studied that carbon offsets or these efforts to offset your behavior often lead to more carbon emissions being emitted, which is the irony of ironies there. And so I think if we pose the challenge back to them, they'll be able to expose their hypocrisies. And more people, like we talked about earlier, are seeing that and are becoming increasingly skeptical of these net zero dictates of getting rid of fossil fuels, of getting rid of agriculture. Or one of the more crazy proposals I've seen recently is to change the composition of cow stomachs to reduce their methane emissions. But that would actually lead to, according to a lot of ranchers and beef producers, lesser quality beef in the process and alter, their chemical makeup, which is insane. And there are other ways to mitigate your footprint, or definitely not lab grown meat, because that is very carbon intensive and would be very destructive actually on the environment. A lot of people don't talk about that nascent industry. But that's very true. And I think going into my next topic or question for you, Chris, about youth issues, and I had alluded to this not long ago or teeing up this discussion, but climate change or fighting climate change always has been touted as this youth-centric millennial top priority, Gen Z top priority. But a new Monmouth University poll that a lot of people are starting to cite have found, not surprisingly, that climate change or fighting climate change, so to speak, is actually very low on the priority list of voters. We see this going into the election. It's not a top 10 issue. It's not even a top 15 issue, because people see that inflation is being exacerbated by these net zero policies, which lead to higher gas prices, utility bills, et cetera, et cetera. That is what is definitely contributing to it, that malaise. So why are young people changing maybe their priority, or maybe not as gravitating towards this issue? Because Monmouth had said that only 15% of viewers view climate change as a determinative issue in terms of going into voting this year in November. It ranked lower than inflation, immigration, abortion. And their poll was very interesting. It says that less than half of the American public, 46%, sees climate change as a very serious problem. It is still higher than 9 years ago, but it's decidedly lower in more recent polling. And compared to 3 years ago, climate change concern has declined 8% among Democrats, Republicans, and even independents. And they even observed that there's a drop in support of government action on fighting climate change. Just over half say it is either extremely important or very important for the federal government to address the issue. So, and again, increasingly among younger people. So why are we seeing that change? Is it because media is shining a light on this hypocrisy that we keep talking about? Or young people are maybe waking up to the fact that this alarmism, this doomism, this not having kids, not getting married because it's bad for the planet rhetoric is falling on deaf ears? What do you think is explaining this poll?
Yeah, I actually posted about the poll, and I'm familiar with it. I actually saw it the other day. I think it was on May 7th that I tweeted about it. And the numbers are interesting, really, because you see a 18 to 20 percentage point drop among the 18 to 34 age demographic. It fell from like 82% in 2018 to 80% in 2021 to 62% for support for government action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a massive drop. And it's the drop is most pronounced among the youth. And it's in the ages 35 to 54, it dropped a little bit. And in 55 plus, it's kind of remained fairly steady around support for government action being about 60 to 61%. And the shift in attitudes, and I've noticed it even among people that I know, people that were kind of more on the fence before very much share kind of my viewpoint now. And I think it's mostly tied, as you said, to current inflation. And as a college student myself, I mean, basic necessities like food and gasoline have become super expensive and unaffordable. I mean, I got like 4 items at the grocery store a couple of weeks ago for my apartment, and I got like a thing of grapes, raspberries, a can of tomato sauce, and some minced onion for the salsa that I make. And I got a couple odds and ends, and it cost $25. I got 16 items there the week before. It cost me $110. I mean, it's ridiculous to fill up my Dodge Ram truck that I drive every week or two that I have to fill it up. It's another $85 to $95, depending on how much gas I have left in the tank. It just nickels and dimes you, and this inflation has made basic necessities unaffordable. And a lot of people, and a lot of young people, a lot of people my age, a lot of them said prior when they first came into college, because they didn't have many expenses, they just lived off their parents' money all the time. They're like, I don't really care much about any of this economic stuff. It doesn't affect me. But once it starts affecting their wallets as they get older, they begin to care more about these things. And of course, a lot of college students like to live beyond their means. So that's part of their spending habits is part of the problem. But regardless, inflation is crippling people of all incomes, especially the middle and lower income classes. And there was a major paradigm shift, and we see this in these polls. We see a major paradigm shift around the time COVID-19 happened, and a lot of the junk science and censorship that went into stifling opinion on people, the people that question the efficacy of masks and the vaccines and lockdowns. A lot of them were considered conspiracy theorists, or they were deplatformed. We saw a lot of people get suspended from Twitter and Facebook over it. And the people who censored them the people who were questioning these things ended up, for the most part, being right. And a lot of people that were wrong don't want to admit it. And there's been a lot of, with the Twitter files release and the government collusion between the White House and social media companies, primarily Twitter, under the previous ownership. A lot of the junk science and censorship that went into deplatforming people and manufacturing a scientific consensus on COVID, it was exposed. And a lot of people, even people in my generation, we talk about it all the time, over lunch or when we're hanging out and stuff. They see that junk science, and they saw that sausage making that went into that, and they see this very similar parallels to climate change and climate science and the consensus science that comes from that and the green agenda. They see that as well as being a smokescreen for authoritarian rule. They see climate policy as nothing more than a pyramid scheme to make low-cost, reliable energy like oil and natural gas. They see that as a sleight of hand to make low-cost energy unaffordable, such that they become reliant on government-approved technologies that are like pretty much wind and solar, because those are the two most heavily federally subsidized forms of energy in the United States over the last 15 years. And these energy technologies are intermittent. They are variable with the weather, which means that it has to be rationed, which plays right into the authoritarian playbook. And that allows the government to restrict our energy use to achieve these net zero emissions by 2050. And they see these concepts of 15-minute cities as a way to restrict people's travel, and the attacks on the meat industry are to dictate what kind of food we can eat. And they promote this lab-grown artificial meat, as you mentioned earlier, and they inject it with who knows what. And it's very carbon intensive. It's not any better for the environment. And I think that a lot of this stuff has really caused this shift. And I think I don't see it as much among millennials, but I do see it a lot with people in my generation that are college-aged students. When I walk around Penn State, when I go up to party with my friends and stuff, and I just run into people and talk to them and walk around campus, or I walk around my own campus at Millersville, a lot of people are waking up to this stuff. We just talk about it in casual conversation, and they're not buying a lot of this stuff. And a lot of them have admitted to me that COVID really, that the censorship and the manufacturing of scientific consensus that went into COVID, they see with climate and the green agenda as well. And I think that's really what's and that combined with inflation and making necessities expensive and unaffordable, crippling on your wallet. That's really what's created this change in attitudes as we head into the 2024 election.
There was also another poll, I think it was a few months ago, a month or two ago, that showed that even younger people were not willing to pay. I think the Daily Mail published this with CRC research, maybe a little more of a right-leaning poll, but they even found that younger people ages 18 to 29 or 18 to 34 were not willing to pay $10 more in increments each month, monthly increments on their utility bill to fight climate change, so to speak, or to fight a climate crisis, a so-called climate crisis. So this might be part of a forward-thinking trend, or emerging trend rather, where maybe we are going to see consistent, maybe disillusionment among young people buying into a so-called climate crisis narrative. So maybe this is not the only metric going forward. I think we may see more polling, like you said, because of just what has happened in the last few years. They see that a lot of these predictions are not panning out, thankfully, these doomsday predictions that the world is ending. Maybe they've been tuned off to what Greta Thunberg is saying because she's gone totally. I mean, she was always very misguided on this issue, but she's now totally gone woke on other issues. So I think people have turned themselves off to her because they see that she's a pawn and not really a good, effective marketer or effective spokesperson on environmentalism, conservation, what have you. And I think what you can take away from this poll is that it's not a disregard for the environment, because my problem, and maybe another thing I want to ask you about too, Chris, is this whole lumping everything to climate doesn't seem to be rooted in scientific basis, because I always hear that climate change is precipitating this problem or this problem or that problem. And I think just blanket stating that something is underpinned by climate, instead of just explaining it empirically why something is going on. I think it was a Gallup poll, Pew Research poll last year that had kind of done a deep dive into skepticism among people and didn't dismiss it. They said that people think the environment or weather changes naturally. It's cyclical. It's not something new or catastrophic. But there are some times, where some events are or appear to be catastrophic. But it was a very interesting kind of look into it. And so this doesn't negate, I think, that if you don't agree with the climate crisis narrative, it doesn't mean you don't care about the environment. It means you support something else. You don't support climate necessarily. You support conservation, or you support classical environmentalism. And I think we are still being told we have to support, fighting a crisis versus supporting true conservation. And I don't think many people, myself included, want to be told we have to pick between a healthy environment versus a sound economy. We can have both. And increasingly, it shows that we can do both. But we're still having to pit between the two. And this climate crisis narrative does not help us.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that I've always found it very frustrating when you deal with the climate activists, these environmentalists. And I don't even think most of them are actually serious environmentalists. The legitimate environmentalists out there are the people who are going out and they're cleaning up trash out of rivers and streams and out of our ocean, and they're dedicating and volunteering their time to cleaning up plastic and making and preventing wildlife from being destroyed by urban sprawl or whatever. As we've seen a lot of in the DC area, because back when my parents were growing up, all of Fairfax and all that entire area was just farmland. And now every 2 days there's a new Walmart being built on every street corner. And it looks different every time I go down there. They keep building and building and building, and a lot of wildlife gets destroyed. So people who petition against that, people who are out there cleaning up our litter, those are people that are serious environmentalists. People who stand outside buildings with signs and protesting all day, they're paid to be activists. They're by these green energy lobbyists and these anti-capitalist groups that they have a political agenda. They're not actually serious environmentalists. A lot of them, some of them might think they are. They might think that they're helping. But most of them are just narcissists who want their own little habitat to live in. They think that there's too many humans. And what's frustrating when you deal with these people is that you can perfectly state that you think that even all of the warming since, say, 1950 has been human caused by greenhouse gas emissions and or land use changes and urbanization. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I do think we have a role to play in that, yes. But regardless, if you do not regurgitate and rehash their humor talking points that the world's going to end in 10 years, which gets pushed back every decade because it never happens. These alarming predictions of sea level rise, the weather is going to get exponentially worse. All these terrible things are going to happen. The oceans are going to boil. All the ice is going to melt. All these predictions that have been made decade after decade that haven't come to materialize. If you question that, but you do accept that there is global warming, which is just a fact. I mean, the planet is warming. We can measure that. But if you accept that there's human activity that plays a role in that, you can be perfectly accepting of that. But if you do not regurgitate their talking points and their narrow line of thinking, you're considered to be a climate change denier. And these people are not willing to ever. I've become increasingly turned off and trying to reach across the aisle to meet in the middle with these people because they are so set in their ways. They're not willing to compromise. They're not willing to meet in the middle. And they just blame everything that happens. They think that the climate was perfectly harmonic and stable prior to 1900 or 1850. They think that there was no bad weather. Everything was peachy. And they think that global temperature, or departure rather, the global temperature departure from 1850 to 1900, that 50-year baseline, they think that is the representation of what the ideal climate's going to be. They think that if we can fine-tune the global temperature through energy policy and set it to some arbitrary value, the pre-industrial baseline, I think that, if we do that, then that's going to control the amount of extreme weather we have, and that's going to reduce our vulnerability to it. But if you actually go back and look at the historical data on floods and hurricanes and heat waves and tornadoes and extreme cold and those snowstorms, any of that stuff, go back to the 19th century, early 20th century, it was in many cases far more extreme than it is today. So the global temperature is not the control knob of extreme weather events or the quality of human life. And in fact, despite the fact that the Earth is warmer now than it was then, the quality of human life has improved. Our life expectancy has doubled since the 18th century. The child mortality is down to record low levels. The share of the world population that's malnourished is down to record low levels. Literacy is up. The number of natural disaster-related deaths are down to over 90%, which you mentioned earlier at the beginning of the podcast, since the 1920s. The fewer people are living in poverty than ever before. The quality of human life is better than it ever has been, largely thanks to fossil fuels and our use of our consumption and use of low-cost, reliable energy. And a lot of those improvements have not been enabled because the climate's warmer, but that might play some role, but because of our technological advancements. So if climate change is having any of these detrimental effects, these horrific things that are supposed to be happening, that's not evident in any of the data. Our ability to mitigate and overcome these things is orders of magnitude far more important than the climate in determining the quality of human life.
Is there anything else you want to add to our conversation as we round out our chat? Because you have talked about a lot of interesting stuff. If people want to connect with you, also dispense the links for people to learn about your musings, your writings, your observations. But anything else you want to add, Chris?
Not really, unless there's anything else that you wanted to touch on it like extreme weather events or my experiences in academia. But you can find me on my website. My blog is chrismartzweather.com. I do blog article postings there, very in-depth analyses where I discuss extreme weather events and look at the meteorology and the science behind them, and I discuss the trends and whether or not the claims that the news media makes about any potential links to climate change are legitimate or not. And usually it's not. And I do really in-depth analyses. I cite studies and data, and it's very in-depth articles that I think a lot of people would enjoy, and a lot of people do enjoy them. I reach tens of thousands of people with that. And then my most active social media presence is going to be on Twitter, and my username is @ChrisMartzWX. So please follow me there if you're listening. And so that's where you can find me. You can contact me privately at chrismartzweather@gmail.com.
Wonderful. I will include all the links to the show notes, and I highly encourage everyone, if you're on Twitter/X, to follow Chris. He has great tweets. That's how I first discovered them. We have a lot of mutual contacts, and it's been wonderful getting to know you, Chris. I hope at some point in the near future we can interact in person. I have no doubt we'll meet in person at some point because we have a lot of overlap, and we may be working together in the near future. So thank you so much for taking time to come on District of Conservation, and we will make sure everyone connects with you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to District of Conservation. If you enjoyed what you heard today, go leave us some reviews on Apple and Spotify or wherever podcasts are played. Your feedback will help us reach more people, and I love to know what is on your mind after each episode. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat or a guest announcement, because that is our way of updating all of you listeners, and we have just hit 1,000 followers on Instagram for the podcast account. Thank you very much. And if you have any guest suggestions or topics you want to hear on the show, I am all ears. I would love to hear your feedback there. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.